St Kilda's coach in 1960 was Jim Francis. He'd lifted the Saints to a 9-9 6th place finish, but sensed his job wasn't safe. He publicly decried players who'd preferred to drink beer rather than train, and laid the boot into the club president. He was sacked, of course, but St Kilda were beginning to turn into a bit of a joke. President Huggins... Really? President Huggins. Sounds like the bloody mayor of Play School. Anyway, President Huggins needed to make a brilliant coaching hire to turn the side around. And that's exactly what he did. He hired a man who was no stranger to the St Kilda Football Club. Remember that day Brian Walsh scored his only goal but for the opposition? Well, 4 goals and a Brownlow vote went to the man who would go on to coach him in 1961, Allan Yabby Jeans. According to those in the know, he was an outsider. Huggins seemed to assume he was a quiet, career-man police officer who would shout at those below while meekly accepting the shouting from on high. What they got, though, was the single most influential figure in St Kilda's history before or since. Allan Jeans stepped into the coach's box of a team that hadn't made a final series in 21 years. This is a list of every coach to have the reins of a 15-year finals dodger thrust upon them. The grey shows how long they were in the job for, and the white shows how long it took for them to make it back into September, if they ever did. Few get it right. Very few do it quickly. No one does it instantly, snaps the streak at the first time of asking, except for Allan Jeans. Now, Allan Jeans was many things. Policeman, footballer, a man named for a type of trousers. But mainly he was the Saints' golden god. He turned the Saints from a bunch of losers whom nothing really happened to, into a side that was worthy of being talked about. These episodes are going to get way, way longer, and you can thank this man for that. His 1961 Saints took the league by surprise in reaching the lofty heights of 3rd place, truly shedding the Invisible Man tag. In fact, they even shed the tag of being the last team to go goalless in a game. That 18 behind debacle looked like a dominant performance compared to the 8 points they allowed Richmond to score. No team, despite Adelaide's best efforts in 2020, has gone that low since. But Allan Jeans, coach of exactly 16 games to this point, said this. That's the kind of man he was. Uncompromising, unrelenting. He was exactly the kind of helmsman St Kilda never had, and never wanted. But he was the kind they needed right now to maximise the most talented lineup they'd ever had. Oh, best on for St Kilda in a goalless game, by the way? Brian Walsh. It had to be Brian Walsh. I love this team so much. St Kilda continued strangling defences with Howell and Roberts holding the line with the equal best defence in the league. But little Bill Young had gone off the boil after Killigrew left and, combined with a series of injuries, played poorly by his standards. They looked to him for goals, but they never came, and Footscray ended the Saints' first finals run in 32 years by only a goal and a half. Actually, speaking of Killigrew, he bopped back up in the 60s. He took charge of a poor, boutique suburban team that had floundered for ages. Remind you of anyone? He had a better win rate with the Kangaroos, just. And much as he had at St Kilda, he beat every other opponent. Well, except for one. As North coach, he defeated Richmond, Carlton, even Melbourne. But there was one side he couldn't manage to best in 7 games. He'd done too good a job at the club he began the turnaround of, and went 0 for 7 against the high-flying Saints.
In 1962 came a win as significant as any other. Collingwood hosted St Kilda here at Victoria Park, a ground they played at since their very beginning days. Now, a lot gets made about Geelong's record at Cardinia Park, but Collingwood here at Victoria Park make them look like an average team. Collingwood won 3 out of every 4 games at this venue. This wasn't just a fortress, this was a slaughterhouse. Even as Collingwood struggled in the 90s, they had a 15-1 record against the expansion teams. And guess who holds the next worst record? Yep, it's our Saints. St Kilda won 9% of their Victoria Park fixtures. Despite their uptick in form over the last 5 years to this point, this was still the one stain on their blouse. Barring University, no team has played 15 matches at one venue for a worse return. Even Port Adelaide, who play at Cardinia Park like they're allergic to the grass, have almost twice the win rate that St Kilda did on the turf I'm standing on right now. And to this point, St Kilda have a 43-year win drought at this venue. Collingwood looked like they're going to take them to the cleaners in the first, but St Kilda fight back and keep Collingwood goalless in the last to record a historic win. And this is it. This is the turning point. This marks the exact moment where St Kilda went from a laughingstock to a credible force in the VFL for the first real time in their history. And this, more than anything prior, proved to Jeans' Saints that they were worthy of running with the best in the business.
A close loss the next week to South Melbourne kick-started a fall down the table. So, in the return fixture, St Kilda were looking for revenge. Bob Skilton really didn't want them to get it. The three-quarter time deficit was 36 points. As Bob Skilton hobbled to a forward pocket with an ankle complaint, Jeans swung some changes. Verdon Howe, the 1959 hero in defence, went up front and scored 3 in just over a quarter, a mark it had taken the Saints nearly 75 minutes to reach as a team to that point. Ross Smith, Oswald, McMillan and Hoyett chipped in, scoring at twice their respective goals per game rates, and St Kilda completed, at the time, the 8th biggest three-quarter time comeback ever, one of 5 chokes at half or three-quarter time for South that doomed them to the 62 spoon. And of the 20 teams to have overcome a 35-point gap at the final change, none had done it from as dire a position scoring-wise than those 1962 Saints. It remains one of their 20 best final term stands, and one of 3 of those to keep the opponent goose-egged. And those other 2 opponents, a war-ravaged North and the awful 1963 Lions, had both scored less than the 62 Swans through 3 periods. This was truly Allan Jeans' masterclass. At the age of 89, they'd finally shedded their awkward teenage phase and showed that they were ready to fly the coup. Yep, much like an underachieving child that's been freeloading off the bank of mum and dad for far too long, it was time for St Kilda to move out.
Junction Oval was a proud ground with a rich history. The first match played here for senior premiership status was way back in 1870, and the Saints moved here in 1874. For a bit. They were like a troubled child. They kept moving out only to keep crawling back. Growing up as they were in their own heartland, St Kilda wanted to run their own venue, warts and all. However, they were beholden at Junction Oval to these guys. They had to find another venue, one that was suitable for VFL footy and one that would let them do things on their own terms. Actually, I think I've found one for them. Here. The Moorabbin Football Club had applied for entry into the VFA in 1951. Its entry requirements granted that a lot of money had to be spent on the ground to maintain it, and thus Moorabbin became one of the best football grounds in the entire league. As the 60s rolled around and it was clear that the VFL had won the Intercode schism, Moorabbin wanted to switch from the VFA to the VFL. The VFL refused entry to Moorabbin outright, so the council had some sit-down talks in 1963 with Fitzroy and Richmond. Those clubs were dissatisfied with the conditions of their current grounds, but both talks failed. In 1964, the council sat down with St Kilda, and luckily we've got exclusive footage of those discussions.
Who'd do that? St Kilda, thanks for joining us. Whew, anything to get away from that goddamn cricket club. Huh? Sorry, I thought I heard something. So here's the deal. We're gonna chuck in $100 grand to get the ground up to VFL standards. How many people do you think you're going to attract? Shall we say 50,000? Cool, 50,000 capacity it is. Now, this is a 75-year deal. We're going to want to see success from you for a long time to come. I'd like to see success at all. What's that? Nothing. So we're in control of the ground this time, right? No sharing with pesky cricketers? Yes, and as you're the ground manager in this deal, we're going to need you to invest some heavy money as well. Yeah, that's a gamble. Huh? Gambling, yes, we should have a social club or something with pokies and shit. Yeah, that'll generate a quick buck for sure. That's great. That should take about £120,000 of investment. Great to see you're as serious about this as we are. Now, we're gonna need to improve the ground annually. How much do you think you're gonna be able to chip in for that? Just a tenner, mate. We're a bit skint after all that. Righto. 10 grand a year it is. I think about 40 years of investment should do. Oh, God. Is there anything else you wanted? Hang on, carry the one. Oh my God, that's so much money. I can't breathe. I need space. Space? Space for growth? Yes, I didn't even think of that great idea. Go on and lease the area around the ground just in case you get more fans in. Wait, we have fans now? I'll draw the paperwork up now. So glad to have you on board.
Aye.
By McNamara's ghost, what is that? That's our VFA team. Say hi. We're gonna be best friends. Please get away from me. Do you want to see my premiership? I just want to look how shiny it is. No, I think I'm allergic to those. No, it'll be great. You'll see. When we're together, we'll be unstoppable.
Let's amalgamate together.
I really don't do that anymore.
Be with me.
I think that went well. Moorabbin Football Club's support of this move and their attempted amalgamation saw them banned from the VFA, and they disbanded without playing another game. They never got a chance to defend their 1963 premiership. Don't cry for him though, he's with the Angels now. Actually, this had bigger ramifications than damning a club. It severed the relationship between the VFA and the VFL/ANFC, triggering a spiral that sent the VFA from respected league to feeder category. So, after an unsuccessful move to poach Brighton's ground in 1959, and after surviving the concept of a name change, the St Kilda Saints would have a new home for 1965.
So, on the 22nd of August 1964, the St Kilda Saints played their last home game at Junction Oval. In front of a crowd of 37,100, they bumpily accounted for the Cats in what was a nice and fitting send-off for their home of 90 years, and a moment that hopefully wouldn't be retrospectively ruined. They ended their tenure at Junction Oval with a 44% win rate, which is pretty good considering their overall win percentage to the end of 64 was just under a third. For those playing along at home, that means the Saints had a win rate away from home of 23.5%. Amazing. And as for the capacity of 50,000, well, that was kind of a waste of everyone's time and money. Yes, it's true that in the first game, a crowd of 51,370 people came here to see St Kilda almost blow a game where they kept their opponents scoreless in the first quarter. But from beyond there, it kind of fell apart. That figure represented 20% of St Kilda's total home attendance that year.
The only season St Kilda would even average a 60% full stadium at Moorabbin was in 1990. Thankfully, the money that the not exactly rich St Kilda got for this project was loaned by the council and repaid as long as they took residence at Moorabbin, so their subpar gate receipts didn't nuke them financially. Yet. It was appropriate though. The only thing in sports eerier than a half-empty stadium is a crap team doing well. Yep. We're about to enter full Allan Jeans mode. It had only taken them 91 years, but they'd finally earned their first minor premiership. This entitled them to play the second place Collingwood, and although they wasted chances early, they beat the more experienced Magpies in a barn burner of a finish, with Ian Stewart playing particularly well. So they'd earned their way to their first grand final since before both World Wars. This is gonna be interesting. The sensation of being in a grand final, despite being favourites, overwhelmed the Saints. Their opponents, though, had won 3 flags in the past 6 seasons and were coached by the greatest player of his era. Even Allan Jeans was overawed, not really knowing what to do or how to act. Allan Jeans called the Saints round to his place the night before, and he G'd his boys up to an extent that they didn't really want to go to sleep. And that shift from hype to sleep to pressure meant the Saints started like this. Yeah, the most accurate side of 1965 by far used only their 5th grand final quarter to date to kick 1 goal 6. Luckily, Essendon were just as allergic to goals, with both teams' first 6 shots sailing either side of the 2 big posts in the middle. This match was actually considered lost media for a long time, and on the strength of the first quarter, I really wish it stayed that way. Darryl Baldock, the skipper, was a clear best on in the first and capped it by scoring the opener, finally breaking the run of no less than 16 shots at goal with no 6-pointers, with a superb finish that was his 7th kick in only the match's 23rd minute, a mark that 10 guys wouldn't pass in the whole match. And this was a significant moment. For the first time in history, St Kilda were leading a grand final. It didn't last for long though. Essendon replied with a 55-yard Ted Fordham torpedo. Then Fordham cops a knock, causing him to mung a torpedo that ends up in the breadbasket of Ken Fraser, the luckiest bastard on earth. He torpedoes it from about 25, because why wouldn't you? Actually, he'd not make the distance from 30 metres early in quarter 2, so it might have been wise to do so here. And Essendon walk into quarter time with a 7-point advantage. Burn that fucking first quarter footage, please. Both sides sharpened up in the second as the quality of play increased. Roland wins a free kick soon after the quarter starts and gives it a bit of a check side to finish smartly. Then, after one of the worst pieces of play I've ever seen, courtesy of Ian Shelton, Des Kennedy and Ken Fraser, the reliable Ross Smith converts to give the Saints the lead again. The Saints use their ruck ascendancy, first through Alan Morrow to generate a chance that goes just wide, then Carl Dietrich loses the battle but not the war, allowing speedy amateur Bruce McMaster-Smith to dazzle the crowd with a run and pass to Big Verdon Howell, the defender moving up forward today. He unleashes a mammoth barrel to move the Saints an even 2 goals up. And then it happens. Sometimes in a game there's a weird bullshit little piece of play that just convinces you that the footy gods have made their choice of winner before the game's over. You want an example? Here's 3 in Adelaide showdown losses alone. In the 1965 grand final, it was this. Jeff Gosper reads a ruck contest to Dustin Martin Clayton Oliver levels of perfection. He bursts away. Bob Murray, the inexperienced fullback, makes an excellent smother, does perfectly, only for the ball, of all the places it could have gone, all the 19,608 square metres of MCG to run to, of all the places it could have gone, to rebound straight back into Gosper's hands. He makes no mistake on the second kick. After that comes a spell of awful-looking shots, including another low-light reel entry from Kennedy, both teams trading behinds. It looks like St Kilda, deep into stoppage time, will carry a narrow lead into the half. It's around this point that the Saints lose Alan Morrow. Morrow was the most experienced Saint on the ground. He proved a valuable target up front, and he was a big presence in the ruck. As soon as he's injured, Essendon begin dominating the ruck work. The Bombers end the half with 2 quick goals to Ted Fordham, both coming directly from clearances where Brian Sampson won the ruck duel. A 4-point lead turns into an 8-point deficit. But Howe kicks off the third quarter with a quick goal to narrow it to 2. And then the Bombers just decided to kick away. The Saints' stoic fight came to a dead stop, and they were outnumbered in scoring shots 4-13. They were fortunate that they were playing a side that had gone at 45% accuracy to this point, in that they were only down by 37 at three-quarter time. It was over. The dream was dead. Or was it?
What are you going to do now with your banner there?
I'm just going to keep it till next year.
Think you'll win then?
Yeah,
You sure you'll win then?
positive.
1965 saw the crowning of yet another Brownlow medalist, Ian Stewart. Stewart dominated the Tasmanian League, earning state honours at only 18. The Saints wanted him to spend 1963 in Tasmania to develop, but Stewart didn't have a bar of it. Using his trademark determination, he leveraged interest from other clubs to ensure St Kilda put him on the park in round 1, 1963. His link-up play with Baldock was almost telepathic, and he became known for his superior balance and ball skills. He won the best and fairest in 1964 as he was moved into the centre of the ground, and he improved further in 1965, taking home Charlie in a barn-burning count over Noel Teasdale in a tiebreak. In both 1965 finals games, he was named as St Kilda's best player. But despite Stewart's triumph, the heartbreak of 1965 was hard to get over. St Kilda weren't the first side to play at Moorabbin Oval that blew a grand final after winning the minor premiership. In 1962, a year before they were wound up to make way for the Saints, Moorabbin bested Sandringham in both the regular season and their first final. The Moors led by 44 at three-quarter time, and it looked over. Until Sandringham scored 8 unanswered goals, the last one by the ruckman from the centre circle, losing in St Kilda by a point. My family even had a hand in it. As Moorabbin desperately fought for that last goal, my grandfather's brother helped propel his 1959 teammates' attacks to grab the W. Good on you, Uncle Bob. But Moorabbin would pay Sandringham back, of course winning the 1963 flag. So, would the club that doomed Moorabbin, only to give the Oval a new lease on life, follow in Moorabbin's redemption story? Well, the early signs looked pretty good. Ian Stewart's 1966 was even better than his 65 season. He averaged nearly 27 disposals, incredible by 1960 standards. Standout performances against Carlton, South, Footscray and North counted for 4 of a league-best 5 best-on-ground performances, giving Stewart the second Brownlow that even Ian himself never thought he'd get. He guided his Saints to a 14-4 record, good for second overall behind a rampaging Collingwood, who they faced in the semi-final for the second year in a row. Actually, that second place was a bit lucky. After a 7-0 start, their finals run faltered and 3 teams had closed in. Richmond, Essendon and Geelong would all get big last round wins, meaning the Saints had to beat the 5-win Hawks, and they only just scraped across the line. And now they'd have to face the best teams in the comp without Carl Dietrich, their young and terrific ruckman suspended for an errant elbow. St Kilda was still confident of a win here, so it breaks my little heart to tell you they were 5 goals down at quarter time. Stewart was nowhere, heavily blanketed by the Collingwood midfield, but the Saints instead turned to their lesser lights like Ross Smith, Alan Morrow and Sinman. Bob Murray began to play out of his skin in a breakout performance, and by half-time, St Kilda were ahead. From there, an epic arm wrestle unfolded. Des Tuttenham kicked 7 and powered Collingwood ahead at the very end to run out to 10-point winners. Collingwood had booked their ticket to the grand final. Meanwhile, St Kilda had to face these guys. This was it, the main event, the grudge match, and it was actually a bit of a wash in the end. St Kilda, again the most accurate team in the league, again were facing an Essendon side that had the goal-scoring accuracy of a brick hurled by a blind man. This time, St Kilda realised it, and they sharpened up in front of goal, winning by 7 goals with only 2 more scoring shots. Almost unbelievably, they'd done it, after waiting for 42 years to taste the ultimate pinnacle of September action. They'd done it 2 years in a row. They were back on that grand final stage. This time though, they were going to know what the hell they were doing. They'd sharpened up, they'd wised up, they'd learned from experience. Surely, this would be it. After all, it kind of had to be. St Kilda wasn't just made up of one team. If you remember, St Kilda had merged with University and Prairie. University just hooked up with him for a quick fling, so they don't really count. In addition, the Saints took members and facilities from South Yarra, who themselves were based on the original St Kilda FC, the first Australian rules football team to have ever formed in April 1858. And of course, Moorabbin had just joined the folds of the red, white and black. Of these 4 teams based in and around St Kilda, with a combined 119 years of history to this point, they'd won 3 senior premierships, a strike rate of 1 every 40 years, and 2 of those were in a league that had just lost its relevance and was well past its peak popularity. The other was in the 1860s. The only real indicator of success in the top level of footballing competition wasn't even won legitimately. You could argue that in their 120 seasons, none of their combined 3 titles really counted, and none of them currently sat in St Kilda's trophy cabinet. And what was the one real trophy they had? A charity shield? Who the hell cares? Jack Dyer had been critical of the Saints in his biography. He thought they were a joke. He knew the squad that they just built was amazing, but he suspected the Saints would, in typical fashion, fail to make the most of it. He said, and I quote, "If St Kilda cannot notch a premiership with these players, or others of a similar calibre, then they never will." So, to put it mildly, the Saints were due for some success. And in the opening stages of the 1966 VFL Grand Final, they set about getting some. St Kilda scored in the first 3 minutes, and then, right afterward, something entirely bizarre but utterly standard happened. Back then, a player who bounced the ball wasn't deemed in possession of it. So when Ted Potter tackles Darryl Baldock, he isn't given a holding the ball free kick like he would in 2023. Instead, he gives away a holding the man free kick some 50 metres from goal. Unbeknownst to Potter, or most of the 101,000 people at the MCG that day, Baldock was playing with a knee injury he'd picked up in training. He said of this kick, "It felt like my knee went further than the ball, but his torpedo kick still sailed on through the middle." The Saints, only 5 minutes in, had a 12-point lead. Gabelick replied with his own long bomb. "Young Brian Minot has his own chance for the Saints, but the ball bounces off the and the goal score. Oh, what was that? Did you just see that too, or was that just me? Let's move on." Later, Gary Wallace, in a dominant first quarter display, snaps on goal, the ball just eluding St Kilda's Brian Sierakowski as he bumps against the goal umpire, who submits a nomination for Best Supporting Actor at the 1966 Oscars. A wasteful Saints then piss away their next 3 chances. 90 seconds after the second term starts, St Kilda nail their third through Griffiths, but again Gabelick replies, this time from 1/100th of the distance of the first. Sierakowski would want to forget that drop almost as much as the accent he put on for a BBC feature film earlier that week. The teams go goal for goal, with the final goal for the half being another of those strange holding the man while bouncing free kicks. Len Thompson has a chance to give Collingwood a half-time advantage, but he only gets a minor score from the goal square. If Collingwood loses by a goal, he'll sure rue that one. Cue the half-time siren and the half-time durries for most of the St Kilda lineup. Again, a goal is scored within a minute of the opening bell as Tuddenham extends Collingwood's lead to 7. Then, a mere 2 minutes later, Baldock is again given a free for being tackled whilst bouncing the ball. And he goals again. Then, like we've seen for the past 60 years or so, we get to see the duality of St Kilda's nature. We, through Cooper, see the unbridled belief they have in their own skill, with a superb goal from 55. Then, 2 minutes later, we see that ever-present comical bungler side of them with a goal square miss by Cowboy Neal. He makes up for his error soon after, though, with a classy finish from 45. Wayne Richardson goals easily from another holding free. Fun fact, Doug Searle won that free kick, but got clobbered. He'd kicked 0 goals 3 so far. He probably would have missed. St Kilda walk into the final change with a 4-point lead that, if Searle was still walking, might have been 9. We've already heard the sort of orator that Jones is. He knew what his lads were truly capable of. He had high standards, but he knew that his boys, if they delivered, could meet them. His three-quarter time speech was his finest burst of inspiration. Bob Murray, 50 years later, could still remember exactly how moving it was. He finished by telling his Chargers that they had 25 minutes to make a name for themselves like they'd never made before. And you know what? They went out there and bloody well gave it a go. Big fat Gablick blows the earliest, easiest chance, and St Kilda need no further invitation. St Kilda have 5 scoring shots in the first 11 minutes of the final term, but 4 are misses. So when that man Tuddenham goals despite Bob Murray's best efforts, the margin is only 7 points. Tuddenham assists Graham to score 5 minutes later, and the margin is a solitary point. Collingwood have the momentum, it's clear for all to see. But Allan Jeans responds in an unusual way. We've talked before about flooding, the act of putting as many players behind the ball as possible to stifle opposition scoring. Jeans did something similar, but also entirely different. He turned all of his players, bar 3 men in the forward line, into on-ballers, trying to force congestion and keeping the ball choked up away from either goal. Unbeknownst to everyone, on this day, Allan Jeans invents postmodern football. But Ted Whitten has his doubts, and I can't say I blame him. A couple of minutes later, the congestion around the pack sees the ball intercepted by Jeff Moran, St Kilda's last goal scorer. He pumps one high to the goal square, where an open player stands waiting. They called him the Cowboy because of his odd-looking legs and weird running style, but Kevin Neal was a serious player. He kicked 8 goals in his debut season. Today alone, he's had 8 shots. Jeans moved him to full forward from his regular rotation in the ruck and the backlines, and it's proved to be a masterstroke. Before today, the man built like a wonky bedside table kicked 50 goals in this, his 2nd season, something no Saint had done since Alan Killigrew walked out the door. Of his 8 shots, he has 4 goals. If he'd kicked a bit straighter, he'd have had the highest single season goal tally from a Saint in 16 years. Pretty good going for a guy who hadn't scored in over half of his games in the previous year. This will be the final shot he will take of what will be his highest scoring season. After this, he will become one of St Kilda's great ruckmen. This shot is to stretch the lead to 7. With a look on his face like he's solving a math problem, he gets his 5th goal to keep Collingwood at an arm's reach. But St Kilda were vulnerable with this tactic if Collingwood found numbers out the back, and they did. Pitt, with about 5 minutes left, drills a torpedo home to reduce the margin, again, to 1 point. 90 seconds later, St Kilda get caught on the break again. It was a gift. Bob Murray decided to perform a drop kick while sprinting. That's the 1960s for you. He chased it up, but the ball ended up in the hands of someone familiar. And there he is. That man. Des Tottenham, the man who knocked up a baker's half dozen on the Saints last time out. It was only fitting, being the architect of this last quarter comeback as well, that he would put Collingwood in front. But he didn't. The 45-metre kick couldn't have been offline by more than half a metre. But either way, he'd missed. The scores were even. But St Kilda were battling against a rolling stone. Their congestion tactics were reliant on Minot's ruck dominance over a tired Gavalik and Thompson. He was AWOL in this contest though, allowing Wayne Richardson to have an open look which missed everything and sailed out in the full. The pressure on the ensuing throw-in was absolutely intense and... Wait, throw-in? What? Yeah, footy was really a different game in 1966. Not only was the holding the man rule pants on head stupid, but we were still 4 years away from free kicks being awarded for kicking the ball out in the full. So instead of having the ball outright, the Saints would have to win it from the throw-in, get the ball out of enemy territory against the momentum, and score, all within stoppage time. Incredibly, and crucially, the Saints get it away, despite Minot going missing again. What are you doing? 2 minutes left, scores still level. Stewart bounces off big Alan Morrow before lobbing a hand grenade that almost goes over the athletic Ian Cooper, whose performance the commentary team cannot stop praising. His kick, representing what could be the final chance for the Saints to wrap this win up today, bungs off the side of a tired boot. This 5 seconds of play is only really important for setting up the play that follows, and normally I wouldn't really talk about it. But this play was symbolic of what the Saints were. It had everything I've talked about so far. The defender playing forward, the superstar they didn't really deserve, a lovable veteran with a massive frame, the squabbling between disorganised teammates, the lesser light performing miracles, and the munged kick at a crucial moment. Can we just look at where this thing was supposed to go? I think it's Peter Boyne there, but I know it's a magpie. This kick deserved to be intercepted, not least because of the insane decision for Cooper to drop kick it. Of course, this being St Kilda, the ball's new target is Collingwood defender Ted Potter, and it wobbles about 99% of the distance to his hands. If it goes a couple of inches further, it's a safe mark. Collingwood rebound, Tottenham lifts the trophy, the end. There's a reason why I'm wasting your only life on earth to wax lyrical about a miscued pass. That lead-up play was peak St Kilda, and if that trend continued, the ball ends up in Collingwood arms. They rebounded, St Kilda lose. The fact that that ball landed where it did, with Barry Breen close enough to pen Potter to the floor, broke something loose from the foundations of the sport of football that had long since set. Collingwood were the famous team, Melbourne were the posh team, Geelong were the bumpkins, Hawthorn were the bottom feeders, Essendon was the exciting team, North were also there, and St Kilda were the team that didn't win premierships. Until this exact moment in time. There was a feeling around that 1966 may well be St Kilda's last chance to cash in on their bounty of talented players. Now, they had an opportunity. They had mere seconds to redeem it. It's time for one of the most important ball-ups in football history. Contesting it for Collingwood was Trevor Steer. He'd replaced Searle after his injury and was Collingwood's reigning best and fairest, filling in for an injured Gavalik in ruck. He'd returned to defence this season with the arrival of Len Thompson, but only registered 9 hitouts since August started, and was only rucking here out of necessity. His heir apparent in Thompson was stranded, exhausted, in midfield. This play would be the last in his VFL career before moving to the country, and he wanted to make it count. St Kilda's warrior in this battle was Brian Minot, who was essentially Dietrich's replacement in the side after Carl's suspension. Despite his earlier mishaps, the ruckman in his sophomore season played a fantastic final term, showing great endurance. He'd worn out the young Thompson and supersized Gabalik with a physical rucking style that would soon become his trademark. Despite his opponent having 4 seasons more experience and 96 minutes less wear on his body, Minot wins the tap. But, again, the ball finds Ted Potter. Potter's made a couple of errors, but he's kept his man to 2 goals and minimal impacts around the ground. He's had a good game. He will later go down in folklore for 2 reasons. The first being that over his 182 games, he will never score a goal, an almost unbreakable record in today's game of more versatile positional utility. The second is what he's about to do. He's tackled. He needs to get rid of the ball, and he does. It's not an awful handball, and under normal circumstances it beats giving away a free kick. But Minot gets an arm on it, and deflects the ball straight to Barry Breen. Breen is second only to Alan Davis in terms of the ages of everyone on the field. He's a tall forward whose kick isn't the greatest, and today his kicking's been terrible. The 27 has had 3 shots on goal that have all missed. Under great pressure, he shoots, hoping that he breaks his run with a miraculous goal that will go down in the annals of history. Of course, this being St Kilda, it mungs off his boot and falls 10 metres short. The footy gods really didn't know who they wanted to win this one. Yes, it was fun to rain more cruelty down on their punching bags in the red, white and black, but even they'd grown sick of seeing Collingwood win. Now, I don't know if they were all looking away at the time and didn't notice, or if they jerkily woke up and willed it to happen. All I know is that those footy gods allowed that ball, of all the places it could have clumsily bounced, of all the places it could have clumsily bounced, to bounce here. The Saints now had the barest of leads. Collingwood had 2 more chances. One was broken up by Minot, and the other, well, unless AFL copywriting steps in, I'll let Mike Williamson take it from here.
There's a goal! Tottenham, a break! Tottenham kicks to centre half forward. They set themselves, and a mark to Bob Murray. A mark to Murray. 28 and a half minutes gone. Hit the boundary line. 28 and a half gone. There's Murray's kick to the wing position on the outer side.
No one really knew what to do. For Allan Jeans, who didn't even think he was good enough for this job, he could barely stand. His players jumped clumsily into each other's arms before lifting Jeans atop their own. Not only had they won their first championship in 93 years, they'd done so in the best grand final in history to this point, against the most winningest side in the history of the game. This was like someone not learning to walk until their mid-40s, then immediately winning the Boston Marathon. Ian Cinnamon, a proud Jewish man, had to get special permission to play today as the match was on Yom Kippur, which was appropriate, actually. It's all about atonement, repentance. You make an error, you atone for it. You miss a goal, you atone for it. You torment a fan base for a century with a lack of success, you better believe that's an atonement. There's a million tales to tell about the men involved, but here's a few of my favourites. Darryl Baldock, the only St Kilda Premiership captain in history to this point, swapping his jersey and being photographed exclusively in Collingwood gear. Ian Sinman being the only man not to engage in the tradition of jersey swapping, which actually ended that year because of those Bulldog photos. Des Tuddenham, the man who destroyed the Saints in the final quarter of the semi, not using all of this space to win the day at the last moment again, and having to stand there next to Bulldog lifting that cup in a Saints kit. Barry Breen, the man whose kicking could well have cost the game for the Saints, being hailed as the hero. St Kilda received an offer to challenge the SANFL Premier, as was usual at the time. They declined for no apparent reason. Which historically is weird because they were one of the first Vic teams to take on an SA side in the first place. Kevin Billing, who walked away with a premiership medal despite never setting foot on the ground. Alan Davis becoming one of the youngest premiership players in history. Ian Cooper, he of the munged kick that changed his club's direction, being retroactively voted as the best on ground for this match. Brian Sierakowski, who did this, ending up with the best defensive stats of anyone that match. Alan Morrow claiming a deserved premiership in his last ever game after having missed half the 1965 grand final. And finally, Allan Jeans' speech to his team. He told them that whatever they do, wherever they go, he'll always remember them for this wonderful moment they gave him today. His words were so powerful that even 40 years later they still had a significant impact on the players. Look at him as he says it. He was a humble man, he never wanted the credit for the miracles he worked, but he deserved that credit. And a good thing he remembered them for that moment too, because things wouldn't get that good again for quite some time. After all, they'd won by accident, while the footy gods weren't really paying attention. They were 6 years into a 50-year run of royally messing with the Pies, making them lose in the most heartbreaking ways as penance for their earlier dominance. The Saints just happened to be there to capitalise, and once the footy gods realised that, they'd hand down punishment to them too. There's always a moment that breaks the back of a winning team and ends their dynasty. For the 2000s Lions, it was the 04 Grand Final. For the 2010s Tigers, it was Alex Rance's retirement. For the uber-dominant Demons, it was Barassi leaving for Carlton. And for the 1960s Saints, it was this. A seemingly innocuous but entirely preventable loss to a spent Melbourne in Round 3, 1967. In their 20th match at Moorabbin, they allowed 6 goals to the Demons in the third term in a Hasser man masterclass, and inaccurate shooting from their titans in Baldock and Dietrich saw them downed by only 2 points. Although they won the next week, a run of 4 straight losses saw them miss the finals. Despite that, though, Ross Smith walked away with the Brownlow medal, St Kilda's 3rd in a row, but it would be their last for 2 decades. They made valiant stands at the start and end of 1968, finishing the season with a vital 50-point win over Geelong to scrape into the top 4. But despite facing the same opponents in the first final, they fell without much of a fight. 1969 was a wash, and again, the Saints missed the finals. Their window was closed. They were finished, and a lot of their heroes were too. Baldock, Howe, Cooper, Morrow and Sinman had all gone. Even Junction Oval had been claimed by someone else, a floundering Fitzroy, who were battered by the Saints upon their return to their old ground. Of course, this being St Kilda, this was the highest score they would register at the ground, meaning they're the only club ever to register their highest score at their home ground as the away team. And even after improved results at Victoria Park, the Saints blew a 52-point halftime lead to lose, the greatest halftime comeback ever to this day. All of this suggested that St Kilda was a different team now. They were done. But Allan Jeans wasn't. Yes, he turned 2 traditional punching bags into premiership winners. Yes, he won the greatest grand final of all time, and yes, he gave one of the great speeches to do it. But I would argue that what you're about to see is the greatest feat Allan Jeans accomplished. Knowing St Kilda to this point, they were ready to do this. 8-win seasons if they were lucky until the next saviour came in God knows how long from now. Instead, Jeans gets 33 wins in his next 50 games. And just like that, it's finals time again. The Saints let a barnstorming first term go to waste, allowing Hoffman and Skilton to run riot with a 7-goal second term. From there though, the Saints didn't look back, demolishing the Swans in a 13-goal-4 second half. And then Carlton happened. Just like the Saints had run away from the Swans, so too did the Blues turn on the Jets. A 2-goal halftime margin quintupled over the next 50 minutes, and the Saints had to watch Carlton go on to win the greatest grand final of that era. 1971 wasn't looking too much better. They'd lost Ian Stewart now, and the man they'd replaced him with left because they put him in the back line. A 2-3 start recovered to 9-6, but the Saints still looked shaky with both of last year's grand finalists still to face. And they beat both of them. And everyone else, in fact. 9-6 became 16-6, and suddenly the Sainters were second. They faced Hawthorn in the semi-final for an automatic spot in the last Saturday of September, and let the Hawks run out to a 31-point halftime lead. They clawed back in the final quarter, keeping the Hawks to a single goal and doubling the amount of scoring shots they had had. But inaccuracy ended up costing them. Another 1-goal opening term in the preliminary final looked like a similar story was being told. But Alan Davis, the youngest Saints premiership player in history, put on a clinic to see St Kilda home by 5 goals. Actually, funny story about that. So we know Allan Jeans is a man with, shall we say, higher standards. So when Alan Davis decided to eat a violet crumble on the bench in the last match of 1971, he had his finals tickets ripped up. But an injury to Glenn Elliott in the semi meant that Jeans had no choice but to send in the chocoholic Davis. And so, after having gone almost 100 years without a sniff of outright success, St Kilda geared up for their 3rd grand final in 7 years. It would be tough though. In addition to Elliott, they'd lost big man OD and John McIntosh to leg injuries. With Carl Dietrich required at half forward, Brian Minot had a big task on his hands, though not as big as the job that fullback Bob Murray would be tasked with. Loyal Gaz-man viewers may remember this video in which I showed every 100-goal season. The Saints were playing against this one, the best. Peter Hudson had kicked 147 goals that season, including 7 in the semi-final and 26 in his last 3 against the Saints. He looked certain to break Pratt's VFL record of 150 after scoring an early goal on an injured Bob Murray. Enter Cowboy Neil. Neil is, as you remember, a St Kilda hero for his goal-kicking exploits in 1966. Now, he was going to be a grand final hero as a defender. He sees Hudson and lines him up. Bang. Talking in 2011, Neil admits that he still feels guilty. He joked before the game that Hudson couldn't break the record if he was unconscious, but hadn't stepped on the field with the intent of gunning for him. It just sort of happened. He broke a finger doing it, but it was an ugly act that would set the tone for a rough and tumble game in the wet. Hudson was left with a concussion that would dog him for the rest of the game. Due to his stardom, they wouldn't sub him off, and due to later injuries to Day and Hawken, they couldn't sub him off. The shot he took after Neil took a shot at him was the beginning of a rough day for him in front of goal. Hawthorn's God was bleeding. Murray had to be switched forward mere minutes later, so although the Saints were weakened, the Hawks were weaker, and St Kilda pounced. Manzi put the Saints up, with Breen adding one from somewhere near St Kilda Beach. Peter Hudson did manage to score a second, and then was gifted a third to tie the record. St Kilda held a delicate 2-point lead at half time, and then little John Bonney arrived. The 71-kilogram rover scored within 30 seconds of the opening bounce and added another 5 minutes later. Kevin Heath was knocked down behind play, adding tension to an already physical encounter. Another to Breen, and then a classy Ross Smith 6-pointer boosted the lead to 27, only 15 minutes into the third. The Saints were marching in to claim their second premiership. All the Hawks could think to do in response was to try and kill each and every Saint that crossed them, from big Carl Dietrich to poor little Stuart Trott. Yeah, classy work, Lee Matthews. It had become one of the roughest, toughest games ever seen. 97 free kicks were paid, high even for the time, with plenty of other tough contests legal enough to not draw free kicks besides. Allan Jeans, who'd been involved in 602 VFL-AFL matches, said in 2011 that this was the toughest of all of them. And having watched it myself, I'd have to agree. The Hawks wasted a couple of chances before Leon Rice finally jagged one, giving St Kilda a 20-point lead in a 12-goal match. By all rights, it was done. Over. St Kilda would win the 1971 VFL Grand Final.
John Kennedy Sr. was one of the great minds of football, but even he could see in that 1971 Grand Final that his team was doomed. With nothing sparking for them up forward, he needed to do something. And then, in a cruel twist of irony, God himself provided the clue that he needed to beat the Saints.
The suburb of Hawthorn had been swept up in Grand Final fever. This was also a club with only one prior flag, also in the 60s, and the idea of another flag caused football to invade every aspect of life. At a Hawthorn church, the billboard outside it read, "What would you do if Christ came to Hawthorn?" A Hawks fan is said to have scrawled underneath, "Move Peter Hudson to centre half forward." The Hawks didn't have Jesus Christ. All they had was a ruckman called Bob. He'll have to do. Kennedy, also one of the great speakers of football, gave an impassioned address to Bob Keddy, who'd touched a ball 5 times to this point and was one of the worst shots for goal in the league. If not for the injuries to Hawken and Day, he'd be riding the Pine Horse by now. That's how bad his day was. Peter Hudson carried himself like the god that he was. Bob Keddy, well, he looked exactly like what you would imagine someone named Bob Keddy would look like. So now, it was the Saints against a God-appointed saviour. The Hawks opened with a Lee Matthews goal, and then Keddy snapped his first barely a minute after. This sparked the Hawks, with Peter Crimmins joining the fun. Keddy then added 2 behinds because he kicked like a drunk mule, but he added a goal right afterwards to give Hawthorn the lead, and all of this was within a tiny span of time. And as if all that wasn't enough to convince the Saints that their God was against them, a Hawk is canonised as a saint. In Catholicism, for a saint to be canonised, 2 miracles must be obtained from God through their intercession posthumously. Peter Hudson was concussed to a point where he was basically a motorised corpse, dead to the world. He held no influence in the physical plane. He could only divinely intervene by doing as his God had told him, and through his intercession, letting that God obtain some damn miracles. The first miracle was turning Bob Keddy into, well, Peter Hudson. And the second was right afterward, as Don Scott rolls a mongrel home through the mud. This thing had no right to go in other than it being divinely governed to do so. Physics be damned. Keddy adds another. Bonnie tries to spark some form of resistance from the centre bounce, but Keddy pops up again with a goal square mark. He tries to give a Joe the Goose to Hudson to give him the record, but only wants one saviour in his name. Bob Keddy scores his fourth to seal it. Davis and Breen strike in junk time to reduce the deficit, but the game had been over for 10 minutes at least, through the seraphic interception of Bob the Redeemer and St. Peter. Hudson later felt no ill will towards Cowboy Neal, who is now remembered more for that act of thuggery than his 5 goals in 1966. Sure, winning the premiership helped, but upon attending Bob Pratt's funeral, he felt a wave of relief that he shared rather than outright broke Pratt's record. Plus, it allowed Bob Keddy to have his moment. He was a 2-time best and fairest winner at the Hawks anyway, including his inaccurate 1969 season, and would win 2 more after moving to South Australia. But this was his magnum opus. In the Manhattan graph of Bob Keddy's life, this is his Empire State Building. Hawthorn had scored 5 goals to three-quarter time. Keddy scored 4 goals too in 16 minutes in the last term, with the 3 goals one added by the others only just outstripping St Kilda. What a painful way to fuck it up. Actually, correction. What a St Kilda way to fuck it up. St Kilda tried to get back up the next year by doing it the hard way, but a 16-point loss in a preliminary final to Carlton slowed their momentum. It sure didn't help matters that key back Jim O'Dea was suspended for half the season, and here's where we get to the first ugly incident in St Kilda's history. Their failures to this point have been bad in a ha-ha kind of way, but we're about to cover their first real dark moment. Round 14, 1972. St Kilda hosts Collingwood. It's early in proceedings and Brownlow medal hopeful John Greening delivers a ball into the legendary Peter McKenna and wakes up 2 weeks later. O'Dea clattered him after the play in a thuggish act of brutality very few, if any, people would associate with St Kilda. McKenna thought Greening was dead. O'Dea got a 10-week suspension and was lucky he was allowed to even play again. They fell to 12 and 10 in 1973 but thrashed Essendon in their elimination final. The semi-final against Richmond was close with only 7 points in it at the final change, but the Saints fell away in the end and that was it. Now, they were done. More of their 66 heroes fell away to time, and new gun signing John McIntosh, himself a critical cog of the 1971 journey, had a career-ending knee injury that potentially robbed him of competing with the great Gary Dempsey for Brownlow glory. Allan Jeans had spent all he had, physically and mentally, trying to lift the Saints back up to the top, but he couldn't quite manage it. He retired at the end of 1976 with a loss to Richmond, his legends gone, his new generation spluttering, and Rex Hunt yibbity-yibbiting 6 behinds as St Kilda failed again to convert in front of goal. One of my favourite things about St Kilda's VFL win chart is that it stays at 0 for just too much time. My other favourite thing is that you can see eras in it. You can see the impact of particular people. Vic Cumberland, Colin Watson, Bill Moore, Alan Killigrew, and, much later, Tony Lockett, Robert Harvey, Nick Riewoldt, and Ross Lyon. But the biggest impact is Allan Jeans. When he came in, they immediately started winning a hell of a lot more. And when he left, they immediately started losing a hell of a lot more. Welcome to the canyon between peaks. Welcome to the nothing years. Welcome to the intermission.